Thank you for joining Talend's Digital Transformation for Oil and Gas panel discussion today, and welcome. My name is Teresa Letlow. I'm an Alliance Manager here at Talend. I currently focus on our Snowflake partnership and how Talend supports our customers in their journey to the data cloud. For those of you who may not be familiar with Talend, we believe that every decision you make should be based on data you can trust, and that drives our product roadmap. So whether you're just getting started with data integration, adding in data quality rules, or building out a full data governance program, our single platform, known as Talend Data Fabric, provides all the necessary capabilities you need to deliver complete, clean, uncompromised enterprise data to all of your users. And you can download one of the resource links or reach out to me after the roundtable today. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few logistics. Number one, audience members will be on mute throughout the event, but you can add your questions for the panelists through our question and answer feature, and we will be addressing those at the end. And for those of you wondering, yes, we will share the recording with you after. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Andrew Myers, our panel moderator for today. Andrew is a research director of oil and gas for IDC Energy Insights, based in Houston, Texas. He leads IDC's worldwide oil and gas program. He's responsible for developing and leading IDC's worldwide research on upstream, midstream, and downstream oil and gas operations. His core research coverage includes the ongoing and accelerating digital transformation in the oil and gas industry. And this is exactly the expertise that we are so excited to have Andrew here today, and why we asked him to moderate our panel. So now I'll hand it over to Andrew to introduce. Welcome.
Great, thank you, Teresa. Much appreciated. So let me get started by introducing our esteemed panel today. First, we have Alistair Love. Alistair is Perficient's oil and gas strategy director and has worked for over 2 decades in upstream, midstream, downstream oil and gas. Next, we have Alan Allen, who's director of IT for Soligen. Alan is currently director of IT at Soligen, but Soligen is a startup specialty chemicals company, and Alan brings a diverse background, which includes over 25 years of IT consulting, oil and gas, and chemicals industry experience. Prior to Soligen, Alan was director of customer business solutions at Motiva Enterprises. Lastly, we have Travis Osborne, who's vice president of IT at Apache Corporation, also based in Houston, Texas, and has been with Apache for the past 9 years, and prior to that was with Stonebridge for 15 years. So first, I want to get started by talking about the macro environment in oil and gas. So obviously, oil price is a substantial hit given the pandemic, but also if you go back about this time last year, some of the major producing countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and Russia, not agreeing on some of the cutbacks in production. So this had an immense impact on WTI and Western Canadian Select alike. But during that time at IDC, we did a bit of a flash survey during the summer, and what we wanted to see was the industry's response throughout the value chain to the oil price downturn. So overall, there's a lot of changing of job roles. There's headcount reductions. We've seen this. This is our 3rd downturn in a dozen years or so. But there's also some new kind of interesting dynamics. So the deployment of automation, particularly in midstream, and a lot more outsourcing and upstream. So I want to turn to the panelists real quick, and let me start with Travis. So we see quite a bit of outsourcing and upstream. We see significant headcount reductions. Is this consistent with what you're seeing specifically at Apache?
I'd say absolutely. As you mentioned, this isn't our first recent downturn that we've had to weather and experience. So unfortunately for the industry, we've become a little bit more nimble when it comes to these events. This one was different, though, certainly from the standpoint of all the things that came together to impact our bottom line. And I do think from our perspective, it's been a real gut check across the industry to say, not only because staffs have reduced and overhead has been cut, but with that goes a lot of experience. We all, I think, feel the difference in terms of losing a lot of experienced workers and professionals from the field. Secondarily, everybody's being asked to do more and do more with less. That goes from field operations all the way through to the corporate office. So automation and cutting out steps and reducing manual effort and being more efficient it becomes a matter of survival, not to dramatize it, but everybody's had to find ways to do that. And they do turn to IT for some of that. We do find that there is inspiration now in the fact that fewer pumpers have to cover greater ground in the field, or we've got more data points that people want to process so we can get our pricing maximized and optimized in the market. So it's become a bit of a pattern over the last 5-6 years, but this one has been different. The two things I'll say on oil and gas is defense. One is that we had a lot of catching up to do with this one because it's forcing us to act like other industries. We've often taken the tact of, hey, well, we're oil and gas, we can afford to lag a little bit behind the technology marketplace. This has really had the effect of dragging us into some more of those modernization discussions than we had before. But the other is that redefinition. You know, our existence is at stake. Our product that we make is under a lot of scrutiny, and how we do it, and the technology and the responsibility and the sustainability and all the things that we need to do are all part of that. It really has had a kind of character identity effect on us as a company, but certainly on our peers as well.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a really good way to characterize it. Alistair, I'm just kicking over to you. Do you have anything that you've seen with your clients, and then Alan next, and anything that rings true about some of this survey data that we have?
Very much so. So Perficient has multiple practices in the data area, including Talend, practices in the Oracle area, and we call back office, IBM, Red Hat, et cetera. And so in our multiple discussions, and we span customer experiences from upstream through midstream, downstream, I think it's especially prevalent in upstream. Travis said this concept of resiliency. There are multiple oil companies who have adopted a tagline that goes something like being able to survive and be profitable in markets that are up and down. And so automation, in our experience, is a conversation again in the back office, the front office. It seems to be picking up speed, support, and there's often opportunity in low times to adopt that.
Great, thanks. And Alan, anything to add? You've got a bit of a downstream perspective. I'd be interested to hear that.
Yeah, I think I do echo what Travis and Alistair said, and I think very eloquently. Downstream's always been a tight margin type of industry, but even with the impacts of this last year, it's been even tighter. And so whereas there was a lot of focus in previous years to maybe not really rethinking processes before trying to implement technologies to support them, to ensure that they've got we have the most streamlined possible process that still meets the needs of the business. That really was probably the first point or first place that we started looking as we got in there, and it was looking at the processes, ensuring that we really took out all the extraneous things that were required or anything that was perceived as unique that didn't really add a lot of business value. And then taking that and driving that with the automation tools, which I think as those have come along over the last few years, that's opened the door to really give the IT organizations and some of these companies a great opportunity to help drive even more business value where in past years it may not have even been considered. And as challenging as the last year has been, it has driven a lot of that innovation because we as an industry have had to figure that out. To say that we're a little bit behind some of the other industries is true, because we hadn't really had to try and find those ways to improve beyond just normal business as usual. And this past year has been an event like no other in my experience that has really challenged us as an industry and individual companies as well, not only to do it better and more effectively and efficiently, but to survive, right? And you have to do it. There's no choice.
Right. Yeah, great perspective. And I like what you talking about having to figure it out. And this is some more survey data that we had from this particular survey was some of the challenges associated with having a remote workforce and trying to continue operations through a time when everyone is working from different remote locations. Some of the most the responses we got were challenges with connectivity with external parties, communication, challenges within teams, project execution. I'll stick with you, Alan, just as a counterparty to oil and gas. Is that something that you're seeing as well, communicating with your counterparties? Is that consistent with what you've seen?
Yeah, coming back into the chemical industry, yeah, that we've seen some of that as well. I think in my current organization, we're fairly small and very much in a startup mindset. So some of the what I would call more defined or matured processes that you see in a lot of the larger organizations that you have to work your way through to ensure that you have the access internally and externally to different parties. We don't have some of those yet because we're still growing and defining how we want to do those interactions. So I don't see as much of that in this particular at Solugen. However, in other organizations where you've got defined tool sets and processes for how you interact with folks, that really caused a rethink. And I spent part of my time in my previous employer, part of my time here, and so I've seen both of them. But that rethink of some of the rules, some of the approaches that we were taking to how we interacted didn't make sense anymore, or they were actually going to stifle our ability to run the business effectively, and that had to be addressed. So.
Yep, that's great. And just to go to Alistair and Travis real quick, some of these connectivity and communication issues, I'd be curious, when the pandemic set on, what did you see? Was it consistent with this? What were some of your biggest challenges?
Say on our part, go ahead, Alistair.
Or go ahead, Travis.
I would say the suddenness of the change, certainly it forced everybody into action and forced everybody to be, I'd say at least early on, accommodating, right? Because you have a lot of new things to figure out on the fly. The two things that we noticed that have stuck with us, I think, even as we talk about returning to office, one is an empathy and an appreciation for the fact that the work in the field in our business never ends. It's 24/7. And we really did, I think historically, we kept kind of a distinction between office work and operations work. And because we started to move towards some platforms where everybody was cohabitating and using them to collaborate and have video calls and to extend the workday and to be in touch with one another, it started to really show a lot more of that reality. And I think it's changed some of our perspective on the IT side about how we need to be positioned to support operations. So that's been one. The other is this nebulous thing called the workday, right? And the way that we all kind of look at technology as a utility in a lot of companies, but the fact that 7 to 4, 8 to 5, or 9 to 6, or what 980s, all those numbers have kind of been thrown out the window from the standpoint of scheduling and managing your teams. And we really had a lot of hand-to-hand work with our functional groups to get to a point where they need help, and we need to help provide them some guide rails on making things fall into a cadence and a pattern that works for their teams. And sometimes technology always on is our goal, but at the same time, it can be detrimental to certainly engagement levels and the sanctity of work life and a lot of the things that everybody's had to deal with over the last 15 months. But I'd say those are both probably long-term effects of this on the connectivity side for us here at Apache.
Great. Alistair, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Andrew, I love Travis's point. Myself, living in the patch, as they so speak it, I live in the Eagle Ford Shale. The concept of empathy for the people actually doing the work and the challenges that they face in terms of connectivity and remoteness is huge. I'm going to really speak to the data side of it and what we see on the enterprise level. A spiked increase in interest in terms of data and the ability to analyze it and to bring disparate systems together, especially on the finance side, to be able to make decisions in a time that's challenging for all. Talend certainly offers that in coordination with other technologies in the data place. And we're seeing increased interest in bringing multiple data sources together to be able to make some cases challenging decisions that involve people, region, operating units, et cetera.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it's really interesting that just some of the field connectivity issues, whether it's data or communication, being challenged in a very short amount of time. I want to wrap up the macro section real quick. I mean, the good news is that equities have recovered. I mean, this just shows Exxon's actually removed from the Dow Jones Industrial Average in August, and has vastly outperformed it since. So conditions are starting to improve. Capital markets for oil and gas are improving. So that's good news. Now I want to move more on to digital transformation within the industry. So thinking about de-siloing the enterprise, we did another survey across the value chain where we surveyed to see where all the IT spend was coming within the business. Was it at line of business or was it core IT? And what we found was that well over 50% was at line of business, and regardless of where you are in the value chain. So you probably got a lot of siloed operations given that. So there is significant IT spend in the business units and throughout the value chain. Travis, I'd like to know, what's your view on centralizing that spend or at least the governance of data and architecture?
I'd say we've worked really hard over the last 5 or 6 years and back to this idea that this isn't our first tough set of circumstances, but probably dating back to one of the prior ones, if you looked at when it really got going, is the real imperative from our executive team and our board to see what it takes to run IT and to run technology in the company. So we've been hard at work with our battle scars to show for it in centralizing the spend and putting in controls not only for things like software purchase and more of the everyday type activities, but for cybersecurity reviews and for the preventative controls on anything we do, whether the vendor or third party is a SaaS provider or a traditional software provider or a hardware provider, anywhere in between, SCADA and otherwise. So we've been very zealous about the centralization part of it. I do think it's helped us in this last year and a half or so, in terms of really calling out the difference between our internal phrasing is wants versus needs, right? And when you're really in a critical situation, a critical condition as a business, the biases and the preferences and the affinities for projects and for pet technology and for things like that, they tend to get fleshed out pretty quick, right? They don't have much room to hide. They don't have much of a case to make for the business in terms of criticality. But I don't think we could have gotten there if we hadn't been centrally focused on spend, because there are, in our case, we're an international company. There are a lot of nuances and variances to how we operate and a lot of time that passes between decisions and contracts, et cetera. if we hadn't had that in place, I'm not sure how responsive we could have been to the command demand that we get our spend in line with where the market was taking us in 2020. I really would have feared the exercise and what we would have found out if we hadn't been centralized by going out and looking for, I need to grab a few dollars here and a few dollars there, and I need to standardize to this package for this function. It would have been very difficult for us.
Great. That's really interesting. And I'd like to get Alan, what are your thoughts on this convergence of line of business and central IT from your perspective, either past or present?
Yeah, past in particular, we had started a similar exercise to Travis. We were only about 3 years into it, but had we not started it when we did, we would not have been prepared. We would not have been prepared to be able to very clearly articulate where the spend was coming from and what was a need versus a want. But it's funny, I almost laughed. I tried really hard not to while he was talking because I feel like we were in the same conversations, just in two different buildings. It was the exact same exercises we were going through because early on, the spend had been spread out across all the different lines of business, and there was no clear view into how much was actually being spent and was it being spent in ways that were adding the most value. And so that we brought back in very quickly within the first couple of years, and that helped us to be able to, when the calls came to say, hey, we got to get really serious and sharpen our pencils, where can we cut and still make sure we're servicing our customers the best possible way? And we were able to do that in a very quick fashion. Within Solugen itself, we started out very much in a decentralized fashion from an IT perspective, and we're pulling it back into more of a centralized fashion, and already starting to reap some of the benefits of that because even in a smaller chemical company, similar kind of proliferations happen that you see in larger organizations. And so you've got to keep an eye on it. And if you don't have one centralized view of how you're spending the IT dollars and tracking to the value that you're getting for that spend, it's very easy for those pet projects to start to take off and get a life of their own, and you don't see the value that you're expecting. And so very much driving all of that back into that centralized view has been very valuable for us, even in the short period of time we've started doing that here.
Great. And Teresa, I'm going to get you in here. What of getting that value from centralization, whether it be, from customers, just some of the projects you've worked on? I'd be curious there.
Sure. So when it comes to looking at the siloed areas of businesses that are using data for different purposes, what we see, and a lot of this is working with companies like Perficient, our companies, we realize that it's not just technology spend. It has to do with processes that a company has. It has to do with the people that are doing it, what the priorities are. And depending on how large or small the enterprise is, you have to really work through all those things. You have to have that center of all of the business and the IT people are coming together to do exactly what this panel has said, is you have to prioritize what are you going to have the biggest results from? Where is your spend going to lead to actual ROI? And one of the things that's really important is that everybody is agreed and looking at the same data points in the same way with the same definitions. And it's not always an easy thing to do, which is why you really have to take a serious look. Some of you mentioned that you've been working on these projects for 3 years. Those companies that have thought about this earlier were much more prepared for preparing for the pandemic than those that had just left the line of businesses running. So
that's really interesting. And we talk about centralization and I think one key topic in oil and gas is ITOT convergence, and one of the most significant barriers or impedance to ITOT integration is concerns about security integrating the systems. So and a lot of that comes from the level of maturity of ops personnel to manage cyber. A lot of IT folks and cyber folks rate a lot of the, not the knowledge, but just experience as it relates to cyber fairly low within the business unit. So when you have a level of spend like that at the business unit before you've centralized, there's a number of cyber risk. They're working on the prevention of shadow IT that goes along with this ITOT convergence. Let me ask you this. We'll start with Alistair, but do you think do older business or older organizational models make sense in terms of cyber with the convergence of IT and OT, and how do we improve that?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and what dovetails to the last point. My answer is going to be emphatically no, because as a digital consultant and advisory services partner who acts in a strategy capacity and a technology capacity at these companies, the concept of line of business and centralized IT in years past have been separate. And you can certainly become engaged in a line of business discussion that holds a lot of value. But if IT has not been involved in that, they don't understand or have precedent over those companies' cyber concerns, time and energy is wasted. And that time and energy is extremely valuable today. So Alan and I think Travis will talk about concepts that are near and dear to their hearts. Total cost of ownership for IT, ROI, change management, adoption, et cetera. And so for those to happen in an efficient manner, inclusive of cyber concerns that have to be dictated from the office of the CIO or the IT management, everybody has to work together. And there's just less tolerance. Multiple people have mentioned this morning, siloed projects.
Great. Yeah, and let me go ahead, Alan. Let me get your view on the older organizational models and maybe where there's some faults there as it relates to ITOT convergence.
Yeah. So there's an interesting challenge that we see, or that I've seen in my recent experience around leveraging some of these older models for some of the systems for manufacturing or refining plants, around trying to leverage some of the more traditional Purdue models for managing the security around your assets. And then you couple that with a lot of the new technologies, a lot of the AI, machine learning technologies. You've got organizations that want to get data out, because what do they need to really refine their algorithms? They need lots and lots of data. And where do you find lots of data? Usually in places where you're producing a lot of product, or manufacturing at a high volume, or producing, commodity out of the ground at a high volume as well. So you get a lot of information that you're capturing at a very fine grain of time slivers, and getting that data to them in a secured fashion in the older models is not as easy as it would appear. And trying to do it in a way where you can actually give them the information they need to help you run your organization more effectively is a challenge, and it's a challenge that I think there's a lot of different ways to address. We are right now looking at how do we do that with some of our partners, and we don't have an answer yet. We've tried a couple of different approaches, and some seem to work better than others. But right now there's a very much a focus on how do you stay as secure as possible, because that the cyber threats in the marketplace today they're just continuing to go up. I was reading an article today around ransomware in 2020, and some of the things that Department of Justice is looking at around that.
That's right.
It's not a simple fix, and I would agree with Alistair that it requires us to think differently about how we tackle our projects, how we create a more interdisciplinary teams to approach those, so that the security or the thought around the value prop doesn't come up as an afterthought. It's very much at the very beginning of the work you're doing to decide around A, which projects you're going to do, and B, how those projects are going to be integrated into the organization. And you're covering the cost in a proper way, and you're getting a true ROI, and you're also protecting your assets in the most effective fashion.
That's great. And I'm glad you brought up the amount of data, and there's a lot of data in a lot of different forms as well. And I mean, this is just an example of just all of the upstream this is just part of upstream data that's structured, semi-structured, and structured. And, I'd like to go to Travis because he has certainly a view of how this works. Travis, what are some of the best practices in data governance and improving data quality, given a lot of companies may be working with, legacy technology stack? What are your views there?
I think that wants and needs distinction that we mentioned before at a macro level has started to show up in our data management discussions, because all of the mission, the imperative, they get this data here, I got to have it, I got to have all of it, I got to have it forever. Historically, I've got to have it for every asset and so forth, has been met with some reality, right? And that reality is who has time to work on this data that everybody's working so hard to try to prep and procure and manage and secure. So we've had a few instances in our shop where the best practice has been really to self-assess and say, even at the management level, why is this important? Why is this data set important? Not everything can be treated in the same classification of criticality, but all of that translates to cost. Not all of it can be tier 1 storage. Not all of it can be real-time acquired. Not all of it can be kept forever. So it's been a way for us to at least introduce the defensive part of data management, i.e. retention and archival, even disposition once in a while. I know that doesn't happen very often in a lot of places, but having those barriers or those guide rails so that we look back at what we drug with us for all these years, and when it really gets to the tight times of where do we spend our dollar, that's been the one that's probably paid off the most. I'd say the second for us is a little more personal, if you will, but we've put a lot of time and effort in the last few years into data center consolidation, and those big events offer an opportunity to really roll up your sleeves and say, this is a new house, right? Am I going to take all of this furniture from my college apartment or from my lake house or from this or from that? Am I going to cram it all into this new house and expect it to look the way and act the way we want it to be? And that's actually, it's a little bit silly, but it has been a way that people have said, you're right. We got all this nice, shiny new hardware. We got this great new data center. We've got all these beefed up network connections. But what are we doing, right? Let's take the opportunity to clean this up, and let's agree that I don't want to throw everything in the dumpster, but I do want to make sure that I treat those tiers of data accordingly by function, as you show in your slide, but also by vintage of
right.
How am I even going to get this back? If I wanted to go look at it, if I wanted to tee it up and warm it up, is it of such an age that we even have the technology to do it? Or is this even warranted to keep on site? Can we archive it somewhere else and then, hydrate it or recall it if we need it down the line? It's been opportunistic, I think, on our part to do that as part of the data center migration as well.
Excellent. Yeah, and you talk about prepping, managing, and securing data. I'd like to get Teresa's view of that. I mean, I can't, I'd imagine you have really good perspective from that on that front.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that's really important for Talend's customers, one of the reasons they come to Talend is, exactly what you're talking about is what happens first of all, what data do you need? But when you get that data moves. It moves from here to there, to there, to there. And what happens to it along the way? Who's touching it? Who's changing it? Who's modifying it? And how do you make sure that, in the example of moving from your college dorm room to a house to whatever, how do you know that chair hasn't changed 14 times at the end, and why? And if you're looking at the same data, is it relevant? Is it timely? Is it important? And that's really something that we focus on with our customers, is making sure that they have that data lineage along the way so they can go back and see what has happened to it. as people have prepped the data, looked at data quality rules and all of that, that you can always go back and see what happened along the way and make sure that it's the data that you should be looking at and that it's relevant.
Yeah, and Alistair, just one thought in your oil and gas clients. I mean, how are you? What are some best practices that you're seeing as it relates to data management?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So, I mean, I think the concept of data integration, which we believe Talend does extraordinarily well, is a very important point. I want to kind of go back to one of Travis's points, and I'm going to be less eloquent about it. But I do remember in years past, the concept of a data lake becoming vogue and people massing large amounts of data. And I'm going to smile with you as well. We've been in these conversations. And then somebody kind of halfway raises their hand up in the room and says, well, great, we've got all this data, but what value is it? Right? So let's come back to the ROI, which I think my peers in Talend will agree with, and what comes from it. For me, a portion of best practice, right, becomes the ability to run what-if models, to really use that data that creates value in the organization. And then I'm also going to kind of include in this discussion, right, consistency in the way that an organization portrays their data internally and externally. We see customers who still have multiple platforms for visualization that produce different models. And I think consistency really helps people use that data and make decisions that drive impactful business.
Excellent, excellent. We've only got a few more minutes left. The last thing I want to talk about is the future oil and gas enterprise, and there's a lot of dialogue about being nimble and agile and migrating to the cloud. But some survey data that we pull up, this probably won't be surprising to anyone, but the only 27% of companies in the space consider themselves cloud first. So we've got a dialogue we want to do. This one thing I want to ask. I want to ask both Travis and Alan. What is your view of the cloud native oil and gas software marketplace? And I'll start with Travis.
I don't want to beat the weather analogy up too bad. It's just too tempting, but it's partly cloudy at best right now, if you want to get real cheesy. The real bulk, the heavy lifting that we do internally by way of software, that's some of the most sophisticated, most complicated, most expensive work done in industry. Right? We get very, very, very talented people using very, very, very complicated software on massive volumes of data. The ability to map that or morph that into a cloud native compute platform or software environment, as we'd suspect, is not easy and it's not cheap. And if we're not subsidizing it, it's very hard for software companies to justify getting there because it's a rewrite of their entire stack in many cases. What we're finding is that some of them are committing to that. They know they have to because it's that time, right? It's critical time for them for survival. But at the same time, the cost of change is what really companies have to internalize, because the degree of integration that has to happen to make those software stacks work, the way that the results are built on several different inbound sets of raw data, you get years and years and years of investment and of corporate knowledge wrapped around those things being functional and serviceable and performant, that you could be looking at years and years and years of change to get them to the cloud. And I think we're, like many of our peers, we're really having to evaluate that time horizon and whether we want to be the early investors, the angel investors in some of that or not, versus letting the cloud aspect of that set of workloads mature and become a little more hardened before we make the commitment to shift. It's a daily conversation in our shop, but it's not going to happen anytime really soon.
And for you, Alan, are you seeing that? I mean, I know you're coming from a smaller company now, but that need to subsidize some of this, what's your perspective on it, or at least the maturity of the market itself? Alan, you may be on mute there. Did we lose him? One thing we do have some data that suggests that there is going to be investment increases, and whether it's subsidized by the end user, that's we will see whether or not who's actually paying for it. But we do see investment increases. This is cloud analytics platforms in particular, and both up and downstream. What's interesting is the amount mid and downstream, considering, I think my personal hypothesis is that the downstream in particular was not quite hit as hard in the first two downturns where they have been this time, where there wasn't a demand shortage for a lot of these products. So now they're going, now we need to kick it up. Now we're actually being sincerely affected by this. So you're seeing some substantial investment from downstream companies, and so this is some of the drivers for analytics platforms in the public cloud. So this is machine learning, AI, IoT, advanced analytics. So that's a lot of the common buzzwords that you're hearing. The last thing I want to talk about real quick is just some of this, the potential digital opportunities. And obviously this is all, the foundation of all of this is the data. And one thing I want to ask Travis specifically about is, whether it's front office, back office, field operations, et cetera, is how do you evaluate what might be a practical solution versus a science project? And how do you view ROI versus soft savings? I know this is a ton of, kind of shifting through the minutia, but I'm curious what your view is here.
I'd say we're not alone, that the payoff on those efforts and trying to sift through the hype, if you will, and maybe the distraction factor, it's something we have not mastered. But what we have seen is that the things that have been the most successful beyond the poster presentation, right? So you think about it from the standpoint of, hey, wow, look what we did one time, are the things that most people don't even see. They become a little bit more baked into workflows, or they become part of an integration data pipeline or things like that cut out steps. They make things faster. They make the flywheel turn a little more often, et cetera. And they are somewhat boring if you want to look at it from a marketing standpoint, because they don't have robotic dogs in most cases running around doing things for us. There's just a lot of stuff about it that you put aside the sizzle and get to steak, and many of the things have been more even in the field operations side of things for us, where helping learn how pumpers should route their day, how they should spend their time in the field. That's not AI. It's being smarter with all the data you have, and then having that pay out every day. A pumper is out doing their rounds in the field across our assets. It's in accounting, where we're looking for anomalies in spend, and it's not, if we look at our power bills and we're taking comparisons of period over period over period power costs for a certain asset, and you find anomalies and you act on them. It's much more assisting the experts in our experience than it is replacing, for sure. Right. And it's not become autonomous in that the trust level is going to take some time in the upstream space, at least in a company like ours. There's going to have to be a generation of trust built up in those assisted use cases before anybody will be ready to turn it over to the robots, so to speak.
Yeah. Yep, and I'd like to get the vendor perspective on that. When you approach clients about value, I'll start with Teresa. What are your thoughts? You know, we talk about something that's practical versus something that might sound like a science project, whether it's real or not. I'm just curious how you approach clients about value.
We always approach our clients about what it is they're trying to achieve, what business problem they're trying to solve. So all of our customers have something that they're trying to fix. Something in their business isn't working the way they want it to. So whether that is, you know, they've been manually tracking service orders and their overtime of their employees is through the roof in meeting their customer SLA, you know, orders on the delivery of their products. Those are the types of things that we go to them and say, okay, you have this problem. What can Talend do to help you solve that specifically? How is that taking your data points from wherever they are, putting them together in a way that you can look at that? What does that predictive model look like so that, you know, the next time the winter storm comes, you're better prepared based on previous history on how you're going to staff for that evening. So you're not getting these, you know, calls at midnight, you know, that you've got to go and deliver some gas to someone who just ran out. So it really is about really uncovering the specific business problem they're having and then building a solution around that.
Great. And Alistair, I'll go to you real quick. What is your view on how you approach clients about value?
Yeah, similarly, I think I'll speak to the accounting side of the house. I mean, we certainly approach it from a business process improvement aspect. You know, when you're engaging accounting teams, as I think Travis and others will tell you, there's often discussions, Excel spreadsheets, no, you're not going to take that away from me. But there's a tremendous efficiency built from modern data structure, applications that do function in the cloud and that have really achievable results in taking flows and consolidation, account reconciliation, planning and budgeting from sometimes what was weeks or month organization to days or hours. So we identify that achievable result, the impact, conclude with the organization that is indeed something of value to them, and then move forward there.
Great. I appreciate that. And I want to tell how all of our panelists how much I appreciate their participation today. We've got a few questions. Please send in any questions that you have for the panel. I'll start with one that isn't addressed to anyone specifically. So this is in the journey to the cloud or the data modernization journey. Where do we start? EOL legacy tech, EOL of on-prem or hybrid model? Is it a business case up to the C-level gaining budget, or with IT to understand their initiatives first? So where do we begin? Let me start with Travis.
I'll give the Apache Experience perspective, because that was a very critical set of moments or decisions on our part. But for many companies, it comes down to the recurring capital outlay that you've got to make to keep things the way they've been historically. And that's the on-prem data center, for example, or the on-prem software warehouse and all the things that you do. We really got to a point from a fiscal perspective that we wanted to change the rules of how we modeled how IT was going to be paid for, and try to get to a point, which is what everybody wants to know from me and all of our teams every day is, you know, why are we spending so much on this, right?
All right.
And with recurring bubbles of big outlays for hardware, for example, you're never in a calm spot where you can say, here's what the curve of this looks like. You're in these constant procurement and replacement and update this cycle of a lot of time, a lot of money. So for us, it was really agreeing that we had a hard time answering those questions, and that we were going to use those opportunities to say, let's change our model to be more like kind of our own version of a cloud would be. How much does it take to run this workload? What's the right software to perform these tasks? And then be able to play back, here's how much it costs in a smaller box to do that. But to start, I do think you kind of look at your own hardware life cycle and refresh cycle, even on storage, and say, okay, this is another 3 years of this, or another N years of this, depending on how you want to finance. Is this the time? Is this the juncture at which we start to change the game some, and we start to change how people perceive us? Because we can then show the daily, monthly, quarterly, yearly trends a lot more accurately than we could before, because otherwise it's just big numbers every budget cycle that everybody wants to wag their finger at.
I like that answer, because I hear that a lot, especially in upstream, is, the hardware life cycle about, we just made an investment in this data center, et cetera, et cetera. This is slowing us down, but it's already done, and so on and so forth. So I appreciate that. Alan, I think we've got you back. What's your view on the where to start that journey?
Yeah, I think we looked at it a lot in the same way that Travis and Apache did as well. Where we went to was, we had a series of investments that were coming to full depreciation. And so we were lucky in timing, if you will, to be able to say, okay, do we want to continue the status quo, knowing what that looks like from a budgeting and cost perspective, or do we want to try to look at things differently? And so we took a little more opportunistic approach to what would work in a different way. How do we do things differently to streamline some of the costs and also provide some more of that predictability that we could get in there? But we started small, and we picked a few small things, and we started to build that runway so that we could see the value and prove out to some of the non-technical, the business folks, the reliability of taking these types of things to the cloud, so they could see the cost savings, but they could also start to get more comfortable with. I know I missed the earlier question, and so I'm tying the two together a little bit, but pulling some of those things out. Now, there are certain things that I don't think we would ever plan to take into the cloud, at least not in the foreseeable future. But there was a lot of opportunity to pull things up into the cloud, do things differently, deliver those capabilities in a different way that were much more cost effective and much more predictable. And a lot of that tended to be in more of the back office space around our accounting, around our finance organizations. And we were able to start doing some of that as well in our trading systems as well. So quite a bit of places that could be tackled in different ways, especially from a downstream perspective.
Great. And let's get the vendor view of this. Alistair, where do you think, where do you start? What are some experiences you've had that, especially within this industry? I'd like to get your perspective there.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So I think it's a pragmatic approach, walk before run. In my experience, it's a very different discussion, IT versus OT. And one that always includes in this industry a discussion of how each company manages CapEx and OpEx and how they do spending in the IT area. And so it's a really interesting kind of conclusion to today's discussion, because it involves cybersecurity, it involves modernization, it involves being able to avail yourself of all of these emerging technologies, if you will, machine learning, robotic process automation. Some of that functionality is available in the on-premise applications. Some of it will never be. It will only be available in the cloud. And so risk tolerance as the CIO, as my peers, hold these positions. Every organization is different. Midstream, I think, is a particularly bright spot for looking at kind of, risk tolerance and what the cloud provides. We certainly see a lot of it in upstream and downstream as well. I would say walk one and have an absolute agreement between line of business and IT.
Really, that's interesting perspective given the survey results from earlier about how much midstream was pushing automation and their migration to the cloud. So that's it correlates there. Lastly, I want to get Talend's perspective, Teresa, if you wouldn't mind jumping in.
Yeah, I just would reiterate what Alistair said. There's always agility versus cost, the prioritization matrix that you're looking at in a company. You've got to move fast in this. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of companies out there, a lot of different industries, and they're juggling with this. The need to move fast because of the competition, but how do you balance the cost there? So I think, Talend's approach, a lot of companies is hybrid, right? What can you do, to Alistair's point, in the cloud right now versus what do you need to continue to do in the current way you're doing it?
Great. So I think that about wraps up our time here. I want to thank specifically the panelists for joining today. Really insightful, and I know we kind of covered a lot of ground, and that was awesome, and no one missed a beat. So on behalf of Talend Proficiency, thank you all for joining today, and we really appreciate it.